They thought the lakeside property was already theirs. "Mom's becoming a burden," my son whispered when he thought I couldn't hear. "We could manage the vacation home better anyway." Their inheritance? I was still very much alive, so I made a decision that would change everything. I sold the house without telling them and used the money to finally live for myself. What happened next surprised everyone, especially me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never planned to become invisible. That's how it happens. Though, not all at once, but gradually, like a photograph fading in the sun until you can barely make out the original image. For most of my life, I was Eleanor Madsen, a woman with hopes, passions, and dreams of her own. Somewhere along the way, those parts of me got tucked away, replaced by Frank's wife and the kids' mom, and eventually, the grandkids' nana. Don't misunderstand. I cherished those roles. But at 63, with Frank gone for 4 years now, I began to wonder if Eleanor still existed beneath all those layers. Our home in Minneapolis was too big for just me, echoing with memories but little. The children, Thomas, Rebecca, and Daniel, had their own families now, scattered across 3 states, but always converging on the lake house in northern Wisconsin. That property had been our family's gathering place for 32 years. Frank and I purchased it when the children were small, stretching our budget thin because he believed every important family memory would happen there. He wasn't wrong. Birthdays, anniversaries, 4th of July celebrations, the calendar of my life was marked by gatherings at Cedar Pines, as we called it. After Frank passed from a sudden heart attack, maintaining both properties became my responsibility alone. I didn't mind, not really. The work gave me purpose, and seeing the grandchildren's excitement when they visited the lake made everything worthwhile. I'd spend weeks preparing for their arrivals, stocking the pantry with everyone's favorite snacks, making sure the boat was in perfect condition, washing all the linens even if they were already clean. I wanted everything to be perfect. "Mom goes overboard," I once overheard Thomas tell his wife Jennifer, "but it's easier to let her do her thing than to convince her to relax." That stung, but I brushed it aside. Being needed, being useful, that had become my identity. What else did I have? My daily routine rarely varied. Wake up at 6, even though there was no real reason to rise so early anymore. Make a single cup of coffee in the machine designed to brew for 2. Check my phone for messages from the kids, usually about scheduling conflicts or requests for babysitting. Spend the morning cleaning a house that never really got dirty anymore. In the afternoons, I'd either babysit for whichever grandchild needed supervision or drive to Cedar Pines to check on the property, especially during the winter months when freezing pipes were a constant worry. Evenings were the hardest. The silence seemed to press in from all sides as I picked at my dinner. Cooking elaborate meals didn't make sense for just one person. Sometimes I'd call one of the children, but they were always rushing somewhere, voices distracted as they handed the phone to my grandchildren for brief, chaotic conversations. "We'll talk more this weekend," they'd promise. But somehow those longer conversations rarely materialized. It wasn't that my children didn't love me, they did in their way. But somewhere along the line, I'd become a resource rather than a person, the reliable babysitter, the keeper of the vacation property, the family historian who remembered which Christmas ornament belonged to whom. I fulfilled these roles without complaint because complaining seemed ungrateful. After all, I had a comfortable life, beautiful grandchildren, and financial security thanks to Frank's careful planning. Still, there were moments when I'd catch my reflection in a store window or mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back. When had my posture begun to stoop slightly? When had I started dressing exclusively in practical clothes with elastic waistbands? Even my hair, once my pride with its rich auburn color, now hung limply in a gray bob I maintained with monthly trips to the same salon I'd visited for 20 years. The usual Eleanor? my stylist would ask, and I'd nod because suggesting anything else seemed ridiculous at my age. Who was I trying to impress? What was the point of change now? Last December, a particularly harsh Minnesota winter had settled in early. The temperatures plummeted to negative numbers, and the snow piled up faster than the plows could clear it. I'd made my usual trip to Cedar Pines to check the heating system and make sure no pipes had burst. The drive back was treacherous, darkness falling by 4:30, the roads slick with black ice. I white-knuckled the steering wheel the entire way home, my heart racing with each passing truck that sent slush spraying across my windshield. When I finally pulled into my garage, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. I sat there for a long moment, willing my heart rate to slow, feeling suddenly, acutely aware of my solitude. If I'd slid off the road, into a snowbank, how long would it have taken for someone to notice I was missing? That evening, I made myself a cup of tea and opened my laptop. I rarely use social media. I had accounts only because the children had insisted it was the best way to see photos of the grandkids. My Facebook feed was filled with family updates I'd already heard about through our group text and advertisements, for products I had no interest in. But then a suggested video appeared. I sold everything at 60 and started over, my solo journey through Portugal. I don't know why I clicked on it. Perhaps it was the woman's face in the thumbnail. She looked about my age, but with a vibrancy I hadn't seen in my own mirror for years. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. Or perhaps some dormant part of me, the real Eleanor who had been hibernating for decades, stirred at the word solo. The woman in the video had a story not entirely unlike mine. Widowed after a long marriage, children absorbed in their own lives, a growing sense of invisibility. But unlike me, she'd made a dramatic change. She'd sold her suburban home, purchased a small apartment in Lisbon, and begun exploring Europe on her own terms. I realized I could spend my remaining years as an afterthought in my children's busy lives, she said, or I could write a new chapter entirely for myself. Her words landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples through my consciousness. A new chapter? The very concept seemed foreign. I'd always assumed the remainder of my life would be a gradual diminishing. Less energy, less purpose, less relevance, until eventually, I would simply fade away. The idea that I could choose something different had never seriously occurred to me. I stayed up until nearly midnight, something I hadn't done in years, watching video after video of women my age traveling solo, starting businesses, moving to new cities, learning new skills. With each story, a long dormant part of me began to awaken. I remembered the Eleanor who existed before marriage and motherhood consumed my identity. The young woman who'd dreamed of seeing Venice and Paris, who'd wanted to learn photography, who'd once applied to art school before practical. Concerns led her to accounting instead. Frank and I had always talked about traveling after retirement. "Once the kids are settled," he'd say, "we'll see all those places you've been dreaming about." But then came mortgages and college tuitions and helping Thomas with the down payment on his first house. There was always a reason to delay, always something more important than my quiet yearnings. By the time Frank retired, his health had begun to decline, and our ambitious travel plans shrank to domestic road trips and eventually disappeared altogether. That night, I dug through the back of my closet until I found an old shoebox filled with travel brochures I'd collected over the years. They were yellowed now, the prices hopelessly outdated, but the images still held their power. The canals of Venice, the lavender fields of Provence, the whitewashed buildings of Santorini. I spread them across my bed, feeling foolish yet strangely exhilarated. Was it really too late? The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, beginning to sketch out what a different life might look like. Maybe not as dramatic as selling everything and moving to Portugal, but something that acknowledged I was still a living woman with desires and curiosities, not merely a support system for my extended family. I was interrupted by a call from Rebecca. "Mom, we need a huge favor," she began without preamble. "Kyle has a conference in Chicago the same weekend as Emma's dance recital. Could you take the train down to Indianapolis and stay with the girls from Thursday through Sunday? I know it's last minute, but you're the only one we trust with them for that long." My first instinct was to say yes immediately. Of course I would help. That's what I did. But something made me hesitate. I had just been making plans for myself, and now, as always, they would be set aside for someone else's needs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Let me check my calendar," I said, surprising both of us. "I'll call you back in an hour." Rebecca's momentary silence spoke volumes. Mom didn't check calendars. Mom didn't delay. Mom was always available, always willing, always putting herself. "Bus, are you okay?" she asked, concern and impatience mingling in her voice. "I'm fine," I assured her. "Just need to check something. I'll call you right back." After we hung up, I sat staring at my empty calendar. There was nothing scheduled, of course. Nothing except the routine maintenance of my quiet existence. But for the first time in years, I felt a stirring of resistance, not against helping Rebecca specifically, but against the automatic surrender of my time and autonomy, without even a moment's consideration for my own needs. I called her back 40 minutes later. "I can come," I said, "but I'll need to leave Sunday morning rather than evening. There's something I need to do back home." The something was entirely fabricated, but even this small boundary felt revolutionary. The weeks that followed brought a subtle shift in my thinking. I began to notice how often my children made plans that assumed my availability, how frequently they spoke about Cedar Pines as if it already belonged to them. "When we inherit the lake house," Thomas had casually mentioned during a family dinner, discussing future renovations he'd like to make. I'd said nothing, but the phrase rattled around in my mind afterward. "When we inherit." As if my death was a scheduled transfer of property, something they'd penciled into their 5-year plans. I began spending more time online, researching places I'd always wanted to visit. I even contacted a travel agent, an actual office I could visit in person, as the idea of booking trips online still intimidated me. Maureen was her name, a woman perhaps a decade younger than me, but with an easy manner that made me feel less foolish about my novice questions. "So many women your age are traveling solo now," she assured me. "It's actually one of our fastest growing client segments. Would you prefer a group tour to start, or are you comfortable setting out on your own?" The question gave me pause. Was I comfortable on my own? I'd been alone for 4 years since Frank passed, but being alone in familiar surroundings was entirely different from navigating foreign countries by myself. The thought was both terrifying and oddly thrilling. "Perhaps a small group tour to begin with," I conceded. "But not one of those enormous buses with 50 retirees, please." Maureen laughed. "I know exactly what you mean. Let me put together some options for you. Culturally focused tours with plenty of free time built in. You'll meet people, but still have independence." I left her office with brochures for 3 different European tours and a strange lightness in my step. I hadn't committed to anything yet, but even the act of exploring possibilities felt transformative. The real catalyst came in late February, during what should have been a routine family dinner at Thomas and Jennifer's. All 3 of my children were there with their spouses, a rare occurrence without the chaos of grandchildren. I'd spent the morning baking Thomas's favorite lemon cake and preparing a casserole to contribute, even though Jennifer had insisted I didn't need to bring anything. The dinner conversation flowed pleasantly enough, revolving around the children's work challenges and upcoming school events for the grandkids. I was content to listen, adding a comment here and there, but mostly enjoying the simple pleasure of having everyone together. After dessert, as Jennifer began clearing the plates, the conversation turned to summer plans. We should coordinate. Our week's at the lake house early this year, Rebecca said. Last summer was too chaotic with everyone showing up whenever. Agreed, Thomas nodded. I'm thinking we take the first 2 weeks of July. The fishing is best then. Daniel, my youngest, frowned. That won't work for us. Sophia's parents already invited us to their timeshare in Florida for the first week of July. I watched this discussion unfold with a curious detachment. No one had asked about my plans or preferences for the property I owned and maintained. Why don't we create a shared calendar for Cedar Pines? Jennifer suggested. We can all input our preferred weeks, and Mom can keep it updated with which family has the house when. Speaking of Mom, Thomas lowered his voice slightly, though I was sitting right there at the table. Have you guys noticed she seems more forgetful lately? Last time I called, she couldn't remember that we'd discussed Emma's science project the day before. My cheeks burned with indignation. I remembered the call perfectly. I'd been distracted because I was in the middle of reading about Italian language courses, but I could have recited every detail of Emma's project on renewable energy. I've noticed that too, Rebecca said, her voice dropping to match Thomas's concerned tone. And maintaining both houses is clearly becoming too much for her. The last time we were at Cedar Pines, half the light bulbs were burned out and she hadn't noticed. I hadn't replaced them because I was waiting for the electrician to check a wiring issue, but no one had asked me that. Daniel, always the peacemaker, interjected. Mom seems fine to me. She's just getting older. We all are. That's exactly my point, Thomas continued. She's getting older, and these 2 big houses are becoming a burden. Maybe it's time we talk about downsizing. There's that nice senior living community near us. Independence, but with support available. What about Cedar Pines? Rebecca asked. We can't sell that. It's our family legacy. Of course not, Thomas assured her. That stays in the Bedai family. I'm just talking about the Minneapolis house. It's too much for her now. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, as my children continued to discuss my future as if I weren't present. My mind flashed back to conversations with my own siblings about our aging parents years ago. The same concerned tones, the same talk of what's best, without actually consulting the person whose life was being rearranged. The realization that I had now crossed into that category, the elderly parent to be managed rather than listened to, hit me with stunning force. We should look into getting her one of those medical alert pendants, Jennifer suggested. My friend's mother has one. That was the moment something crystallized within me. I wasn't yet the feeble old woman they were describing. Yes, I moved, more slowly than I once had. Yes, sometimes I forgot things. But I was still vibrant, still capable, still very much alive and in possession of my faculties. Yet somehow, I'd allowed myself to be incrementally diminished in their eyes, and perhaps in my own. I can hear you, you know, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest. I'm sitting right here. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Thomas had the grace to look embarrassed. Sorry, Mom. We're just concerned about you. Are you? I asked. Or are you more concerned about how I fit into your plans? Rebecca reached for my hand. Mom, of course we're concerned about you. We love you. We just want what's best. What's best? The phrase grated against my nerves. What's best for whom? Had anyone bothered to ask what I wanted? And what makes you think you know what's best for me better than I do? I asked, surprising myself with the edge in my voice. Daniel jumped in, ever the mediator. Let's all take a breath. No one's making any decisions tonight. We're just talking. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak further without tears. The conversation awkwardly shifted to safer topics, but something had fundamentally changed. I saw myself through my children's eyes with painful clarity, a declining asset, a responsibility to be managed, a burden to be shifted around their busy lives. And I saw Cedar Pines for what it had become. not my cherished second home, but an inheritance my children were already mentally spending while I was still very much alive. The drive home that night was silent, except for the drone of the heater and the occasional swish of the windshield wipers clearing the light snowfall. My thoughts, however, were tumultuous. All those videos I'd watched, all those women who'd reclaimed their lives, they had seemed like fairy tales, entertaining but ultimately not relevant to my practical Midwest existence. Now I wasn't so sure. I pulled into my garage and sat in the darkened car, making no move to enter the house. This home had sheltered our family for over 3 decades. It had witnessed birthday parties and graduations, arguments and reconciliations, the ordinary miracles of family life. But it had also seen my slow erosion, my gradual acceptance of invisibility. The familiar walls suddenly felt less like comfort and more like confinement. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the hallways of my house, running my fingers along the familiar walls, looking at family photos with new eyes. In nearly every image, I was half hidden, standing behind the children, positioned at the edge of the frame, my smile supportive rather than joyous. Even in the visual documentation of our lives, I had accepted a peripheral role. By morning, as weak winter sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains, I had made my decision. If my children saw me as a burden and the lake house as their rightful inheritance, perhaps it was time to challenge both assumptions. I wasn't dead yet. Cedar Pines was mine. Frank had left everything to me with the understanding that I would eventually divide things fairly among the children. But eventually was a nebulous concept, and I was beginning to think that fair might look different than any of us had imagined. I picked up my phone and called Diane Westerman, a realtor I'd met through my garden club. Unlike my children, she never spoke to me as if I were slightly deaf or mentally diminished. She treated me like a competent adult. "Diane," I said when she answered, "I'd like to discuss selling a property, and I'd like to keep this absolutely confidential for now." There was a pause before she replied, "Of course, Eleanor. Would you like to meet at my office this afternoon?" "That would be perfect," I said, a strange calm settling over me. "And Diane?" "This conversation never happened." She chuckled. "Client confidentiality is sacred in my business. I'll see you at 3. Diane's office was warm and welcoming, with large windows overlooking a tree-lined street. She greeted me with a firm handshake and offered me coffee in a real ceramic mug, not the throwaway kind that suggested hurry. Already, I felt respected. "So," she said once we were settled, "which property are you considering selling?" "Cedar Pines," I replied, saying the name aloud, making it suddenly more real. "My lake house in Wisconsin." If Diane was surprised, she didn't show it. She simply nodded and pulled out a notepad. "Tell me about the property." For the next hour, we discussed the practical details: the 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, the boathouse, the private dock, the half-acre of wooded land with 80 feet of shoreline. Cedar Pines wasn't extravagant, but lakefront property in northern Wisconsin had become increasingly valuable over the years. Frank had been prescient in buying when he did. "The market for vacation properties is quite strong right now," Diane explained, "especially ones with established structures in good condition. People want turnkey solutions where they can immediately start creating family memories." Family memories. That's what Cedar Pines had been for us. But whose memories would it serve? Now? "There's something else you should know," I said hesitantly. "My children don't know I'm considering this. They expect to inherit the property eventually." Diane's expression remained neutral. "And you're concerned about their reaction?" I nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt that I quickly pushed aside. "They've made it clear they see the lake house as their birthright. But the thing is, Diane, I'm still here, and I'm starting to realize I might have other plans for the next chapter of my life." She leaned back in her chair, studying me thoughtfully. "Eleanor, I've been in real estate for 25 years. I've helped hundreds of people through major life transitions. One thing I've learned is that property is never just about the building or the land. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we deserve." Her words resonated deeply. Cedar Pines had been central to our family narrative for so long, I'd never questioned whether that story still served me. "If you decide to sell," Diane continued, "we can handle it with the utmost discretion. Limited showings, no public open houses, no announcement in the local papers. And we can close quickly for the right buyer." I felt a flutter of nervousness. "How quickly? For a desirable property like yours, assuming it's priced appropriately? We could potentially have an offer within weeks and close within 60 days after that." 60 days. In 2 months, I could be free of Cedar Pines and all it represented, both the decades of joyful gatherings and the growing weight of obligation. The possibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I need to think about it," I said finally. "Of course," Diane replied, handing me her card. "Take all the time you need. This is a significant decision." But as I drove home, I realized my mind was already made up. The only question was how to proceed without creating a family rift I might never be able to repair. Over the next week, I developed a strategy. I would need to visit Cedar Pines one more time, ostensibly to check on it after the harsh winter weather. While there, I would quietly gather the few personal items that held true sentimental value for me. Frank's fishing tackle box, the quilt my grandmother had made, the collection of smooth stones the children had gathered from the lake shore when they were small. Everything else could stay with the house as part of the sale. I called Rebecca to let her know I was driving up to check on the property. "Do you want company?" she asked. "Kyle could take the girls for the weekend, and I could come with you." "No need," I said casually. "It's just routine maintenance. I'll be back Sunday afternoon." The drive to Cedar Pines felt different this time. I noticed details of the landscape I'd overlooked for years. The way the terrain gradually transformed from flat farmland to rolling hills, the subtle shift in the quality of light as I drove northward. The radio remained off. I wanted to hear my own thoughts without distraction. When I arrived, the house stood silent and waiting, just as it always had. I unlocked the door and was greeted by the familiar musty scent of a place closed up for months. Moving through the rooms, I began the usual reopening routine, checking pipes, turning on the water heater, opening windows to air out the winter staleness. As I worked, memories surfaced unbidden. Thomas learning to swim off the dock, his little arms flailing as Frank stood nearby, ready to catch him. Rebecca's 16th birthday party, when we'd allowed her to invite friends for an entire weekend, the house filled with teenage laughter. Daniel, always the quiet one, sitting on the screened porch for hours with his sketchbook, capturing the eye-changing light on the water. These memories weren't contained in the structure itself. They would remain with me, with all of us, even if the physical place was gone. This realization gave me an unexpected sense of peace. I spent that night alone at Cedar Pines, sleeping in the master bedroom Frank and I had shared for so many summers. In the morning, I began the careful process of selecting what to take with me. Not the furniture or the appliances or even most of the photographs. Those could stay. Just the few irreplaceable items that connected me directly to the past I wanted to preserve. By noon, my car was packed with 3 small boxes and my overnight bag. I took one final walk through the house, touching familiar surfaces, saying goodbye silently to each room. Then I locked the door, tucked the key under the mat where the real estate agent would find it for showings, and drove away. On the journey home, I called Diane. "I'm ready," I said simply. "I'll prepare the listing agreement," she replied. "Come by tomorrow to sign the paperwork." A peculiar lightness filled me as I continued driving. For the first time in years, I was taking a decisive action that wasn't about caretaking or maintaining the status quo. This was about me, about Eleanor, and the life I wanted while I still had the health and energy to live it. The following day, I signed the paperwork with Diane, officially listing Cedar Pines for sale. The asking price, based on recent, comparable sales, was significantly higher than I'd anticipated, nearly double what Frank and I had paid 3 decades earlier. Diane recommended a slightly aggressive pricing strategy, explaining that the property's pristine condition and prime location warranted it. Since you want a quick, discreet sale, we'll market it directly to a select group of pre-qualified buyers looking specifically for lakefront property, she explained. No signs, no public announcements, just targeted outreach to people who can afford to move quickly. I nodded, feeling an uncomfortable mix of excitement and guilt. Was I betraying my children? Or was I finally honoring myself? And remember, Diane added, you're under no obligation to disclose your plans to anyone until you're ready. The sale will become public record eventually, but that doesn't happen until after closing. By the time I left Diane's office, Cedar Pines was officially on the market. I had set in motion a plan that would irreversibly change my relationship with my children. There would be no turning back once the sale was complete. For the next few weeks, I lived in a strange limbo. On the surface, nothing had changed. I continued my usual routines: grocery shopping on Tuesdays, bridge club on Thursdays, babysitting for Emma and Lily when Rebecca needed me. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, everything had shifted. I was no longer just going through the motions of a life defined by others' needs. I was actively planning for a future of my own design. I began researching in earnest the places I might want to visit, or perhaps even live. After watching dozens of travel videos and reading countless blog posts, I had narrowed my focus to several possibilities. A month in Italy, exploring the small hilltop towns of Tuscany. Time in the south of France, where I could finally use the rusty French I'd studied in college. Or perhaps something completely unexpected, like the coastal villages of Portugal that had first captured my imagination. The idea of living abroad, even temporarily, both thrilled and terrified me. Could I really manage in a country where I didn't speak the language fluently? Would I be lonely without my familiar support network? But then I thought about my current reality, the subtle condescension from my children, the assumption that my remaining years would be spent in progressive decline, the growing invisibility of being an aging woman in American society. Suddenly, the prospect of navigating a foreign subway system seemed like the lesser challenge. I created a separate email account for communications with Diane and travel research. I cleared my browser history after each search session. I even drove to the next town over to purchase a small fireproof safe where I stored the listing agreement and other paperwork related to the sale. The secrecy felt strange, almost adolescent in its furtiveness, but it was necessary. I needed time and space to make this transition on my terms, not in response to my children's reactions. Diane called 3 weeks after we listed the property. "Eleanor, we have an offer," she said, her voice professional but tinged with excitement. "It's slightly below asking, but it's clean. No contingencies, all cash, and they're willing to close in 30 days. I gripped the phone tighter. How much below asking? She named a figure that was still substantially more than I had ever imagined Cedar Pines could be worth. They're a couple from Chicago, empty nesters looking for a place to eventually retire. They've seen the property twice and fell in love with it. Chicago. Not locals then. Less chance of my children discovering the sale through community gossip. Do they want any of the furnishings? I asked. They're hoping to keep most of it, actually. They like the rustic lived-in charm. They'd adjust the purchase price up if you're willing to leave the major furniture pieces. Leave it all. Walk away with just the memories and the freedom they would purchase for me. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I'll take the offer, I said decisively. with the furniture inclusion. Wonderful, Diane replied. I'll draw up the paperwork right away. We're looking at a closing date of... She paused, checking her calendar. May 15th. May 15th, just 6 weeks away. Memorial Day, the traditional start of the summer season at Cedar Pines, was the following weekend. My children would be expecting to begin their annual migration to the lake house, just as they had for decades. That works, I said, pushing aside the anxiety that immediately bubbled up. 6 weeks to figure out how to tell them. 6 weeks to prepare for the aftermath. The sale proceeded smoothly, almost eerily so. The inspection revealed only minor issues, which the buyers agreed to accept without repairs. The title search came back clean. The appraisal matched the sale price. Each step brought me closer to a financial freedom I hadn't anticipated and a confrontation I was dreading. 4 weeks before closing, with all contingencies removed and the sale all but guaranteed, I knew I could no longer delay telling my children. I considered various approaches: individual conversations, a group email, a family dinner, but none seemed quite right. How do you tell your adult children that you've sold the vacation home they've treasured their entire lives without even consulting them? In the end, I decided on a family gathering at my house. No grandchildren, just my 3 children and their spouses. I would prepare a nice meal, open a good bottle of wine, and then simply tell them the truth, not just about the sale, but about the awakening that had led to it. I sent a group text. Dinner at my house this Saturday, 6 p.m. Just adults, please. Important family matters to discuss. The responses came quickly. Thomas, sounds serious? Everything okay? Rebecca, Mom, you're not sick, are you? Daniel, we'll be there. I responded simply, everything's fine. Just need to talk about some plans. Looking forward to seeing you all. The days leading up to Saturday stretched endlessly. I cleaned the house thoroughly, planned and prepared a menu of everyone's favorites: Thomas's beef bourguignon, Rebecca's roasted vegetable salad, Daniel's chocolate mousse. If this was to be a difficult conversation, at least it would happen over good food. Saturday arrived with unseasonable warmth, a perfect spring day that seemed at odds with my nervous energy. I set the dining room table with my best china and Frank's favorite tablecloth. I arranged fresh flowers in the center, filled the ice bucket, and made sure there was plenty of wine. Thomas and Jennifer arrived first, precisely at 6, always punctual. Daniel and Sophia followed shortly after. Rebecca and Kyle came last, apologizing for the delay. Emma had been reluctant to stay with her friend for the evening. Mom, the house looks beautiful, Rebecca commented as I took their coats. And something smells amazing. I've been cooking all day, I replied with a smile that felt strained. Go on in. Everyone's in the living room. Drinks were poured, appetizers passed around. The conversation flowed easily. Work stories, updates on friends, community gossip. I participated automatically, laughing at the right moments, asking appropriate follow-up questions, all while a separate track ran in my mind. Soon. I have to tell them soon. When we moved to the dining room, Thomas raised his glass. A toast, he said, to Mom for bringing us all together, as always. Everyone clinked glasses, smiling at me with genuine affection. My throat tightened. These were my children, my flesh and blood. I had devoted my life to them, and they did love me in their way. Was I making a terrible mistake? But then, I remembered their conversation about me, about the senior living facility, about managing what was best for me without my input. I remembered the casual way they had already divided up Cedar Pines in their minds, planning renovations, for a house they didn't own. I remembered the growing sense that I was becoming a footnote in my own life story. We were midway through the main course when Daniel, always the most perceptive, set down his fork and looked at me directly. "Mom, you said you had something important to discuss. We're all here now." The table fell silent. 6 pairs of eyes turned expectantly toward me. I took a deep breath, then a sip of wine, steadying myself. "Yes, I do have something to share with you all." Another breath. "I've made a decision that's going to affect our family traditions, and I wanted to tell you in person." Rebecca's hand found Kyle's under the table. Thomas sat up straighter. Jennifer's smile became fixed. "I've sold Cedar Pines," I said simply. "The sale closes on May 15th. The silence that followed was absolute, as if someone had suddenly muted all sound in the room. I could see them processing my words, confusion giving way to disbelief and then to the beginnings of anger. Thomas broke the silence first. "You what?" "I sold the lake house," I repeated, my voice stronger now, "to a couple from Chicago. They're paying cash, and they want most of the furniture to stay." "But why?" Rebecca's voice was small, hurt. "Why would you do that without talking to us first?" "Cedar Pines is a family legacy," Thomas added, his tone hardening. "We've been going there our entire lives. The kids are growing up with those same traditions." Daniel said nothing, but his eyes never left my face, studying me with an intensity that reminded me of his father. I set down my wine glass carefully. "The lake house belonged to me. Your father left it to me. Not to all of us collectively. And yes, it has been a wonderful family gathering place, full of beautiful memories. But it's also become something else, an obligation, a responsibility, and most recently, an assumption." "What does that mean? An assumption?" Jennifer asked, her lawyer's mind honing in on the key word. "It means," I said carefully, "that decisions were being made about Cedar Pines without me. About when each of you would use it. About renovations you wanted to make when you inherited it. About its role in your futures. All while I'm still very much alive and capable of making my own decisions." Thomas's face flushed. "We were just planning, Mom. Of course we know it's your house." "Do you?" I challenged gently. "Because that's not how it felt when I heard you discussing my limitations and how the lake house maintenance was becoming too much for me. It felt like you were already mentally moving me into that senior community and dividing up my assets." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "That's not fair. We were concerned about you, about how much work 2 properties are for someone your age." "My age," I repeated. "I'm 63, Rebecca, not 93. I'm perfectly capable of deciding what's too much for me. And right now, what feels too much is being slowly erased, becoming background in my own life while everyone else makes plans around me." Kyle, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "So this is... what? Punishment? Revenge because you felt left out of some conversations?" I shook my head firmly. "This isn't about punishment. It's about recognition. Recognizing that I'm still here, still capable of growth and change and desires of my own. For 40 years, I've oriented my life around what was best for this family. Now, I'm choosing something different." "And what exactly is that?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What was so important that you had to sell our family home without even a discussion?" I looked at each of their faces, the children I had raised, the adults they had become. They deserved honesty, even if it was difficult to hear. "I'm going to travel," I said. "Something your father and I always planned to do but never got around to. I'm going to see the places I've only read about in books. I'm going to live differently, on my own terms, while I still have the health and energy to do so." "Travel?" Rebecca repeated, as if the word were foreign. "For how long?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I'm starting with 3 months in Italy and France. After that, I'll decide what's next." 3 months? Thomas's voice rose. "Mom, be realistic. You've never even been to Europe. You don't speak the languages. You've barely traveled outside Minnesota and Wisconsin." There it was. The doubt, the subtle condescension, the assumption that I couldn't possibly manage something new at my age. "I'm a quick learner," I said calmly. "And there are guided tours, language apps, and entire communities of solo women travelers who help each other navigate new experiences." "But what about us?" Rebecca asked, her voice small. "What about the grandchildren? Emma and Lily are going to be devastated about the lake house, and they need their grandmother." The guilt card expertly played. I had anticipated this. "I'll be gone for 3 months, not forever," I reminded her. "We have video calls. I'll send postcards. And when I return, I'll have stories to tell. Them about a grandmother who was brave enough to chase her dreams." Daniel, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "How long have you been planning this?" Trust Daniel to ask the one question that went to the heart of the matter. "The seed was planted months ago," I admitted. "But the decision to sell came after I overheard you all discussing my forgetfulness and the burden of maintaining 2 homes. It made me realize how I was being perceived, not as a person with agency and dreams, but as a problem to be managed." Thomas winced. "Mom, that's not how we see you." "Isn't it?" I challenged. "When was the last time any of you asked me what I want for the next phase of my life? Not what's best for me, not what's most practical, but what would bring me joy?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "The lake house sold for more than I ever imagined," I continued. "There's enough for me to travel comfortably and still have a secure future. I've already consulted a financial advisor to make sure I'm being responsible." "And what about our inheritance?" The question burst from Jennifer, who immediately looked mortified at having spoken the quiet part aloud. I wasn't shocked or offended. The expectation had been implicit for years, that Frank's and my assets would eventually pass to the children. It was the natural order of things. "Your inheritance," I said carefully, "is not guaranteed, nor is it imminent. I plan to live for many more years, and I intend to use my resources to create a life that is meaningful to me. Whatever remains when I'm gone will be yours. But I will not arrange my remaining decades around preserving assets for you to inherit someday." The remainder of the dinner was tense. Rebecca cried quietly. Thomas alternated between trying to reason with me and barely suppressed anger. Daniel watched and listened, saying little. Their spouses offered occasional comments, but mostly stayed on the sidelines of what was fundamentally a parent-child conflict. By the time dessert was served, the chocolate mousse that no one really had an appetite for anymore, the initial shock had begun to give way to resignation. The lake house was sold. The papers were signed. There was no going back. "When do you leave?" Daniel finally asked as we moved back to the living room with coffee. "June 1st, I replied. "I fly to Rome, spend 2 weeks there, then travel north through Tuscany and eventually into southern France." "Alone?" Rebecca asked, still disbelieving. "The first part is a small group tour," I explained. "After that, yes, on my own." As the evening wound down, I could see wheels turning behind my children's eyes, processing, calculating, adjusting to this new reality with a mother who had suddenly revealed herself to be unpredictable. When they finally left, there were perfunctory hugs, promises to talk more soon. But an unmistakable chill had settled between us. I had upended their expectations and asserted my autonomy in a way that challenged the dynamic we had all tacitly accepted for years. Alone in my kitchen, washing the dishes I had chosen not to leave for morning, I felt a curious mixture of guilt, grief, and exhilaration. I had hurt my children. That was undeniable. The loss of Cedar Pines represented more than just a property. It was the tangible center of our family traditions, the physical manifestation of countless happy memories. But I had also, perhaps for the first time since Frank died, chosen myself. I had looked squarely at the narrowing path my children and society had laid out for me. The gradual reduction to caretaker, family resource, and eventually burden, and stepped decisively off it onto uncharted terrain. As I dried the last wine glass and turned out the kitchen light, I whispered to the empty house, "Frank, I hope you understand." And somehow I felt he would. He had always seen me more clearly than I sometimes saw myself. The following days brought a flurry of text messages and phone calls from my children, some angry, some pleading, some attempting to find compromise in a situation that allowed for none. Thomas suggested I reconsider and try to back out of the sale. Rebecca wondered if I could at least delay my trip until after summer, so the grandchildren could have one last season at the lake. Daniel asked pointed questions about my financial plans and travel safety. I held firm, answering their concerns patiently but without wavering from my decision. The sale would proceed. My tickets were purchased. My journey would begin as planned. Gradually, a fragile new equilibrium began to take shape. Thomas stopped, calling as frequently, his disapproval evident in his silence. Rebecca shifted from overt attempts to change my mind to anxious questions about practical matters. Did I have the right adapters for European outlets? Had I arranged for mail forwarding? Who would water my plants? Daniel, as always, surprised me. A week after our difficult dinner, he arrived at my door unannounced, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag containing my favorite almond croissants. "I've been thinking," he said as we settled at my kitchen table. "You've spent your entire adult life taking care of other people, Dad, us kids, the grandchildren. Maybe it's not so crazy that you want something for yourself now." Tears sprang to my eyes at this unexpected understanding. "Thank you," I whispered. He shrugged, looking embarrassed at my emotion. I downloaded some Italian phrases on my phone. "Thought we could practice a little if you want." And so we did, laughing at my terrible pronunciation, Daniel patiently correcting me as I struggled with the unfamiliar cadences. It was a small olive branch, but a significant one. The first, acknowledgement from any of my children that this new path might be legitimate, even positive. As the closing date approached, I began the practical work of preparing for both the sale of Cedar Pines and my upcoming journey. I sorted through the belongings in my Minneapolis home, setting aside what I would need for travel, what would stay, and what could be donated or given away. I made arrangements for my mail, my bills, my houseplants. I renewed my passport, purchased travel insurance, and downloaded language apps on my phone. Each step made the abstract more concrete. This was really happening. I was really going. The closing for Cedar Pines took place on May 15th, as scheduled. I signed the final paperwork in Diane's office, officially transferring ownership to the Chicago couple who had fallen in love with our family's sanctuary. As I handed over the keys, a lump formed in my throat, the physical symbol of releasing not just a property, but a chapter of my life. "Congratulations," Diane said warmly as she handed me the cashier's check, a sum that still seemed unreal to me. "What you're doing takes courage." "Does it?" I wondered aloud. "Sometimes it feels more like selfishness." "Eleanor," she said firmly, "there's a difference between selfishness and self-determination. You've earned the right to author the next chapters of your life." I deposited the check that afternoon, watching as my modest bank balance transformed into a figure that represented possibility, freedom, choices. The financial advisor I'd consulted had helped me develop a plan, a portion for travel and living expenses, the rest carefully invested to provide ongoing income and security. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the Minneapolis sky in shades of pink and gold. 2 weeks until departure. 2 weeks to bridge the gap between the Eleanor I had been and the Eleanor I was becoming. My phone chimed with a text from Rebecca. "Just realized Mother's Day is this Sunday. The kids want to make you breakfast. Okay if we come over around 9? Mother's Day. I had completely forgotten in the whirlwind of preparations. I typed back quickly, "That would be lovely. Looking forward to it." Perhaps this final Mother's Day before my departure could begin to heal some of the hurt I had caused. Perhaps my grandchildren's uncomplicated love could remind all of us what truly mattered. Not a house or an inheritance, but the bonds between us. Bonds that could stretch across continents without breaking. The morning of Mother's Day dawned. Bright and clear, a perfect spring day. I woke early, feeling both excited and apprehensive about seeing my family. When the doorbell rang at 9, I opened it to find Emma and Lily on my doorstep, both clutching handmade cards and small wrapped packages. "Happy Mother's Day, Grandma," they chorused, wrapping their arms around me. Behind them stood Rebecca and Kyle, both wearing cautious smiles. To my surprise, Thomas, Jennifer, and their children had come too. Even Daniel and Sophia were there, making this the first complete family gathering since our confrontation. The kitchen quickly filled with cheerful chaos as the children insisted on making pancakes, all by ourselves, with minimal adult supervision. Rebecca hovered anxiously, trying to prevent a complete disaster, while Thomas set the dining room table. Daniel caught my eye and gave me a reassuring nod. Breakfast was a noisy affair, with the grandchildren dominating the conversation, eagerly sharing school stories and asking about my upcoming trip in the same breath. Their enthusiasm was uncomplicated by the adult tensions simmering beneath the surface. "Will you bring us presents from Italy, Grandma?" Jack asked. "Of course," I promised. "Something special for each of you." "Can we video call you while you're there?" Emma wanted to know. "Mom said we can see the places you visit on the computer." "Absolutely," I assured her. "I'll show you the famous fountains in Rome and the canals in Venice." Their curiosity was refreshing. No judgment, just excitement about new experiences. I caught glimpses of my adult children watching these exchanges, their expressions a mix of resignation and something else. Perhaps a dawning recognition that my journey might actually be something positive, not just a selfish abandonment. After breakfast, as the children played in the backyard, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Rebecca. She was loading the dishwasher, her movements brisk and efficient. "You don't have to do that," I said. "It's Mother's Day." "Force of habit," she replied with a small smile. After a moment, she added, "The girls are going to miss you." "I'll miss them too," I assured her. "But it's only for the summer. I'll be back before you know it." Rebecca turned to face me fully. "Will you, Mom? Or is this just the beginning? Once you're out there, seeing all these places, meeting new people, what if you decide not to come back?" The question caught me off guard with its raw honesty and underlying fear. "Rebecca, Minneapolis is my home. You children are my family. I'm not disappearing from your lives. I'm just expanding mine." "It's hard not to feel like we're being punished," she admitted, "for taking you for granted." "This isn't punishment," I said gently. "It's self-preservation." I looked ahead and saw the future that was being arranged for me. A gradual fading into dependency, my world getting smaller and smaller until it consisted of just my house and occasional visits from family. I needed something different. "I never meant to make you feel invisible," Rebecca whispered, tears welling in her eyes. I reached for her hand. "I know that. And I never meant to hurt you by selling cedar pines. But sometimes we have to make difficult choices to become who we need to be." Rebecca squeezed my hand, then released it to wipe her eyes. "So, Italy, huh? Dad always said you two would go someday." "He did," I smiled, remembering Frank's promises. "I wish we'd had the chance to go together." "He'd be proud of you," Rebecca said softly, "for being brave." It was the first indication that any of my children might see my decision as courageous, rather than selfish or irrational. The validation, especially from my most traditional child, felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. The remainder of that Mother's Day passed in a gentler atmosphere. Not perfect, not entirely healed, but moving in that direction. When everyone finally left, with hugs and promises to help with my final preparations, I felt a cautious optimism. Perhaps the bonds of family were more elastic than I'd feared, able to stretch across new distances without breaking. The 2 weeks before my departure flew by in a blur of practical preparations. I arranged for my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to keep an eye on my house and collect any mail that slipped through the forwarding service. I purchased a new suitcase with smooth rolling wheels that could navigate cobblestone streets. I downloaded travel apps, made photocopies of my passport, and set up international service on my phone. My children responded to my imminent departure in characteristic ways. Thomas became intensely practical, sending me links to travel safety articles and insisting I download certain emergency apps. Rebecca focused on making sure I had everything I could possibly need, appearing at my door with travel-sized toiletries and a money belt. Daniel, always the most intuitive, simply called occasionally to ask how I was feeling about the upcoming journey. 5 days before departure, I received an unexpected visitor. Jennifer, Thomas's wife, arrived one afternoon carrying a sleek laptop bag. "Thomas doesn't know I'm here," she admitted as I invited her in, "but I thought you might need some help with technology for your trip." For the next 2 hours, Jennifer patiently walked me through various apps, currency converters, translation services, mapping tools, and photo storage. She showed me how to use video calling to stay in touch with the family and how to back up photos to the cloud. As we worked, I discovered a warmth and humor in Jennifer I hadn't fully appreciated before. Perhaps I'd been too quick to categorize her as just Thomas's wife, missing the individual beneath the role, the very thing I had resented in how my children sometimes saw me. "Why are you doing this?" I asked as she wrote down step by step instructions for uploading photos. She paused, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Because I admire what you're doing," she said simply. "It takes courage to rewrite your story at this stage of life." Thomas doesn't seem to see it that way. Jennifer smiled ruefully. "Thomas is afraid. You've always been the fixed point in his life, the mom who's always there, always the same. This change threatens his sense of security." Her insight into my son surprised me. "You understand him well." 14 years of marriage," she shrugged. "And he's more like you than either of you realize. Stubborn, principled, afraid of vulnerability." Before she left, Jennifer handed me the laptop bag. "This is for you. It's my backup tablet, newer than yours, with better battery life and camera. I've already loaded all the apps we talked about." I started to protest, but she waved me off. "Consider it an early birthday present. And..." She hesitated, then continued. "I hope you'll send us pictures. Not just the kids, but Thomas and me too. I want to see Italy through your eyes." I hugged her tightly, this unexpected ally. "Thank you for understanding." "Just promise me one thing," Jennifer said as she stepped onto the porch to leave. "Don't let fear stop you from anything you want to experience. Not Thomas's fear, not your own." As my departure date approached, I found myself experiencing wildly fluctuating emotions. Excitement followed by terror, confidence replaced by self-doubt. What was I thinking? A 63-year-old widow who had barely traveled outside Minnesota, suddenly jetting off to Europe alone. Was I having a delayed midlife crisis? Or was I finally, belatedly, claiming the life I had always wanted? The night before my flight, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through my quiet house, touching familiar objects, saying a temporary goodbye to the space that had sheltered me for decades. In my bedroom, I opened the closet and pulled out a small wooden box I kept on the top shelf. Inside were letters Frank had written to me during our courtship and early marriage, before children and mortgages had consumed our lives. I sat on the edge of the bed and carefully unfolded one, dated June 1978. "My dearest Eleanor, it began in Frank's neat, precise handwriting. Being apart these 2 weeks has only confirmed what I already knew, that my life is immeasurably better with you in it. Yesterday, I watched the sunset over Lake Michigan and thought how much more beautiful it would be if you were beside me, to share it. Someday, I promise, we'll see all those places you dream about together. Rome, Venice, Paris. The world is waiting for us, my love. A tear splashed onto the yellowed paper. I carefully blotted it with my sleeve, refolded the letter, and returned it to the box. I'm keeping your promise, Frank, I whispered, just a little later than we planned. Morning came with startling swiftness. I dressed in the travel outfit I'd planned, comfortable layers for the flight, sensible shoes, a light scarf that could double as a blanket if the plane was cold. My suitcase waited by the front door, packed and repacked multiple times until I was confident it contained everything I needed. The doorbell rang at precisely 10 a.m. I expected the Uber I'd ordered, but when I opened the door, I found Daniel, standing on my porch. "Thought you might like a ride," he said with a small smile. "Better than a stranger." Behind him in the driveway was his car, and to my shock, Thomas's SUV as well. As I watched, Rebecca emerged from her vehicle parked at the curb. "What's all this?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "Did you really think we'd let you start this adventure without a proper send-off?" Daniel replied, lifting my suitcase. "The kids wanted to come too," Rebecca explained as she joined us. "But we thought that might be too chaotic. They sent these instead." She handed me a stack of handmade cards. Thomas hung back by his car, his posture stiff, his expression conflicted. I handed the cards to Rebecca and walked down the path to meet him. "You didn't have to come," I said gently. He looked past me, jaw tight. "Daniel said it was important. Family tradition and all that." I waited, saying nothing. Finally, Thomas met my eyes. "I'm still angry about Cedar Pines," he admitted. "I can't pretend I'm not." "I know," I acknowledged, "and you have every right to those feelings. But," he continued with obvious effort, "you're my mother. And if this trip is important to you, then I want you to be careful. And I want you to," he struggled for the words, "to find whatever it is you're looking for." It wasn't a blessing exactly, but it was acceptance of a sort. From Thomas, who saw the world in clear lines of right and wrong, it was a significant concession. "Thank you," I said simply. He nodded once, then gestured to his trunk. "I brought something for you." He opened it to reveal a small, high-quality rolling suitcase. "It's a carry-on that fits international size restrictions. Jennifer said your other bag might be too big for some of the budget airlines in Europe." The gift was so practical, so quintessentially Thomas, that I felt tears spring to my eyes. "It's perfect," I told him. We transferred my carry-on items to the new bag while Daniel loaded my checked luggage into his car. Then, to my continued surprise, all 3 of my children climbed into Daniel's vehicle with me. "We're all coming to the airport," Rebecca explained, "to see you off properly." The drive to Minneapolis-St. Paul International was filled with last-minute advice and questions. Had I downloaded my boarding pass? Did I have my passport in an accessible pocket? Had I let my credit card company know I'd be traveling internationally? I answered patiently, touched by their concern even as I recognized the role reversal. Now they were the anxious parents, I the child venturing into the unknown. At the airport, Daniel found a parking spot, and we all walked to the terminal together. At the entrance to the security line, where they could go no further, we stopped for goodbyes. Rebecca hugged me first, fiercely. "Call when you land," she whispered, "no matter what time it is here." "I will," I promised. Daniel's hug was gentler, but no less heartfelt. "Be amazing, Mom," he said. "Take lots of pictures." Thomas stood awkwardly for a moment, then surprised me with a hug that lifted me slightly off my feet, the same way Frank used to embrace me when he was particularly moved. "We'll be here when you get back," he said gruffly. "I know you will," I assured him. And then it was time. I gathered my new carry-on and my courage, showed my boarding pass to the security attendant, and turned to wave one last time to my children, my first family, the people who had defined me for so long. They stood together, these adults I had raised, watching as I took my first steps into a new chapter. Security was a blur of removed shoes and scrutinized electronics. The walk to the gate seemed endless, my heart pounding with a mixture of exhilaration and terror. Was I really doing this? Was I, Eleanor Madsen, widowed homemaker and grandmother, actually flying to Rome alone? At the gate, surrounded by other travelers, business people tapping on laptops, families corralling excited children, couples leaning into each other, I felt a moment of profound doubt. What if my children were right? What if this was a foolish endeavor, doomed to failure, an older woman's grasping attempt to recapture a youth long past? I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a small travel journal Rebecca had given me. Opening to the first blank page, I wrote, June 1st. Today, I begin the journey that Frank and I always planned to take together. I carry him with me in my heart, along with the love of our children. But this is my journey now, Eleanor's journey. I don't know what awaits me across the ocean, but I know this. I am not merely an aging widow, a grandmother, or a burden. I am a woman with dreams yet to fulfill and courage enough to chase them. The announcement for boarding came over the loudspeaker. I closed the journal and returned it to my bag, feeling calmer now, more centered. Whatever happened in Italy and beyond, whether triumph or challenge or some mixture of both, I had already achieved something significant. I had claimed my right to self-determination. I had insisted on my own visibility. As my boarding group was called, I stood and gathered my belongings. The woman who walked confidently toward the jet bridge was not the same one who had listened silently as her children discussed her limitations and planned her future. That Eleanor had been, gradually fading, accepting the diminished role assigned to aging women in our society. This Eleanor, the one stepping onto an international flight with a suitcase and a heart full of possibilities, was fully alive, fully present, fully herself for perhaps the first time in decades. The plane taxied down the runway, gathering speed until that magical moment when the wheels left the ground and we were airborne, Minneapolis falling away beneath us. I pressed my forehead against the small window, watching as the familiar landscape of my life receded, becoming a patchwork of diminishing squares and rectangles, then disappearing altogether as we ascended through the clouds. 11 hours later, as the plane began its descent into Rome, the cabin filled with the excited murmurs of passengers gathering belongings and preparing for arrival. I checked my reflection in the small mirror of my compact, my gray hair slightly mussed from the long flight, lines of fatigue around my eyes, but something else too, a sparkle, a vitality I hadn't seen in years. Fiumicino Airport was a maze of signs in Italian and English, crowds flowing in complex patterns I couldn't quite decipher. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm me. What had I been thinking? I didn't speak the language, didn't know the customs, had never navigated a foreign country on my own. Then I remembered Jennifer's calm instruction. When you're feeling lost, just stop. Take a breath. Look around. There's always a sign pointing the way if you take the time to find it. I followed her advice, stepping aside from the flow of travelers, taking a deep breath, and methodically scanning my surroundings. There, the universal symbol for baggage claim. I could start there. Step by step, I made my way through customs, retrieved my suitcase, and found the taxi stand. The driver, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard, smiled when I showed him the address of my hotel written on a slip of paper. "First time in Roma?" he asked in accented English. "First time anywhere," I admitted. He nodded approvingly. Then you choose the best anywhere to start. Roma is the eternal city. She welcomes everyone, especially those who come with open hearts. As we drove through the outskirts of Rome and into the historic center, I pressed my face against the window like an excited child, trying to absorb every detail. The scooters weaving fearlessly through traffic, the ancient ruins standing in stark contrast to modern buildings, the vibrant street life unfolding at every corner. My hotel was a small family-run establishment on a narrow cobblestone street near the Pantheon. The room was modest but charming, with a wrought iron bedstead, crisp white linens, and a window that opened onto a tiny balcony overlooking a courtyard filled with potted lemon trees. I unpacked my few belongings, splashed cold water on my face to revive myself after the long journey, and then, despite my fatigue, went back downstairs. The afternoon sun was casting a golden glow over the city, and I couldn't bear to waste a single moment of this new adventure. The hotel receptionist, a young woman named Lucia, looked up in surprise when I approached the desk. "Signora Madsen, you must be tired from your journey. You don't want to rest?" "I've been resting for years," I replied with a smile. "Now I want to see Rome." She laughed, delighted by my enthusiasm. "Then you must start with the Pantheon. It's just 5 minutes walk from here. Follow this street to the end, turn right, and you cannot miss it." With Lucia's simple directions, I set out into the streets of Rome. The city embraced me immediately, the warm air carrying the scent of coffee and baking bread, the musical cadence of Italian conversations flowing around me, the centuries of history embedded in every stone and archway. When I turned the final corner and the Pantheon came into view, I stopped in my tracks, momentarily overwhelmed. The massive dome, the ancient columns, the sheer endurance of this structure that had witnessed nearly 2,000 years of human history. It was humbling and exhilarating all at once. I found a small cafe with outdoor tables facing the piazza and ordered my first authentic Italian cappuccino. As I sat there, watching the ebb and flow of tourists and locals through the square, a profound sense of rightness settled over me. I belonged here, not as someone's mother or grandmother or widow, but simply as Eleanor, a woman experiencing the world on her own terms. I reached for my phone to capture the moment and found a text message waiting from Daniel. "Landed safely? Let us know." I smiled at his concern and quickly typed back, "Safe and sound in Rome. Already having my first Italian coffee. The Pantheon is more beautiful than any picture could show." Almost immediately, my phone pinged with replies. "Daniel, knew you'd hit the ground running. Enjoy every minute. Rebecca, the girls want to know if you've seen any Roman soldiers yet." And then, most surprisingly, from Thomas, "Dad would be proud." I tucked the phone away, blinking back unexpected tears. The vacation home they thought they would inherit had set me free in ways none of us could have imagined. And perhaps in time, they would understand that the true legacy I wanted to leave them wasn't property or possessions, but the example of a woman who had found the courage to rewrite her own story. As the sun began to set, bathing the ancient stones of the Pantheon in golden light, I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to Frank, to my children, to the woman I had been, and most of all, to the woman I was becoming. The journey was just beginning, and for the first time in decades, I couldn't wait to discover what came next. Rome welcomed me with open arms, embracing me with warmth and beauty beyond anything I'd imagined. My first week passed in a blur of guided tours through ancient ruins, leisurely coffees in sun-dappled piazzas, and evenings spent studying Italian phrase books in charming trattorias. I'd joined a small group tour as planned, 12 travelers ranging in age from 30 to 75, all drawn to Italy's artistic treasures for different reasons. To my surprise, 4 of us were women traveling solo after major life transitions: a recent retiree, a new divorcee, a widow of 3 years, and me. The reset sisterhood, joked Marianne. The divorcee, as we shared a bottle of Chianti one evening. All reinventing ourselves after 60. I prefer to think of it as continuing our story, not starting over, replied Catherine, the widow, whose quiet wisdom often reminded me of myself. The previous chapters weren't mistakes. They were necessary to bring us here. I savored her words, finding comfort in their truth. My life with Frank, raising our children, nurturing our family traditions at Cedar Pines, none of it had been a mistake. Those chapters had shaped me, but they didn't have to define my conclusion. Each evening, I dutifully sent photos to my family, ancient columns bathed in golden sunset light, plates of pasta arranged like artwork, the Spanish Steps crowded with tourists and lovers. The grandchildren responded with enthusiastic emojis. Rebecca asked practical questions about my accommodations. Daniel sent thoughtful observations about the architecture. Thomas rarely replied directly, though Jennifer occasionally messaged, that they had enjoyed seeing where I'd been. After Rome came Florence, where I fell in love with the Renaissance masterpieces that had previously existed for me only in books. I stood before Botticelli's Birth of Venus for nearly an hour, mesmerized by the goddess emerging fully formed into the world, carried on a seashell to her new life. There was something in her serene expression that resonated deeply, the calm acceptance of transformation, of becoming. In Venice, our tour concluded, and the moment I had both anticipated and dreaded arrived, continuing on alone. Catherine and Marianne were heading to the Amalfi Coast, while the others scattered to various destinations across Europe. We exchanged contact information with promises to stay in touch, though I suspected most of these connections would fade with distance and time. On my first morning alone in Venice, I woke early, momentarily disoriented in my small hotel room. A pang of homesickness hit me unexpectedly. What was I doing here, an aging widow wandering foreign streets alone? Perhaps Thomas had been right. Perhaps this had been an impulsive, foolish adventure driven by hurt feelings rather than genuine desire. I reached for my phone, half tempted to check flights back to Minneapolis. Instead, I found a message from Daniel sent hours earlier. "How's Venice, Mom? Saw this article about a special exhibition at the Guggenheim there and thought of you." He'd attached a link to an exhibit featuring women artists of the 20th century. The simple thoughtfulness of it, Daniel recognizing something that might interest me, reaching across the ocean to share it, brought tears to my eyes. I wasn't just a mother or grandmother to be managed. I was Eleanor, a woman with interests and curiosities worth acknowledging. I replied with thanks, put down my phone, and got dressed with renewed purpose. The exhibition was exactly the destination I needed. The Peggy Guggenheim collection was housed in an unfinished palace on the Grand Canal, its white stone exterior understated compared to the ornate buildings surrounding it. Inside, however, was a world of bold creativity, women artists who had defied convention, pursued vision over security, chosen expression over conformity. Standing before a striking abstract canvas by Lee Krasner, I felt a kinship with this woman who had stepped out of her famous husband's shadow to claim her own artistic identity. We were separated by decades and circumstances, yet united by the universal female experience of reclaiming selfhood after being defined by relationship to others. "Magnificent, isn't it?" came a voice beside me, the English words wrapped in a melodic Italian accent. I turned to find a distinguished-looking man about my age studying the same painting. His silver hair contrasted with lively brown eyes that crinkled warmly at the corners. "Yes," I agreed. "There's something powerful about her use of color, like controlled chaos." "Exactly," he exclaimed, clearly delighted by my observation. Krasner understood that true life contains both structure and wildness. One cannot exist honestly without acknowledging both. We moved through the gallery together, exchanging observations about the artwork, introducing ourselves between discussions of composition and historical context. His name was Paolo, a retired architecture professor who had returned to his native Venice after teaching in London for 30 years. And you, Eleanor? What brings an American woman to Venice alone? He asked as we paused before a sculpture. The question was asked with genuine curiosity, free from the judgment I'd grown accustomed to hearing from my children. I found myself telling him the truth about Cedar Pines, about the conversation I'd overheard, about my decision to sell the lake house and use the proceeds to finally see the world Frank and I had always dreamed of exploring together. Brava, Paolo said simply when I finished. To recognize when one stage of life has concluded and to consciously choose the next. This is true wisdom. We ended up having lunch at a small restaurant tucked away from the tourist crowds. Paolo was easy company, knowledgeable without being pretentious, attentive without being intrusive. By the time we parted that afternoon, we had made plans to meet the following day. He would show me his Venice, the quiet corners and hidden treasures most visitors never discovered. Back in my hotel room that evening, I found myself smiling. As I sorted through the day's photos, I hesitated before sending one to my children, a selfie I'd taken with Paolo at the Guggenheim. Would they misinterpret this new friendship? Would Thomas see it as validation of his fears, that I would be vulnerable traveling alone? After a moment's reflection, I sent it anyway, with a casual caption. Met a retired architecture professor at the Guggenheim today who showed me the best hidden restaurant in Venice. Making friends around the world. The replies came quickly, revealing much about my children's personalities. Rebecca. Be careful, Mom. Don't tell strangers where you're staying. Thomas. Is that wise? You don't know anything about this person. Daniel. Looks like you're having a great time. Dad always said the best part of travel was the people you meet. I smiled at their predictable responses. At 63, I was being treated like a naive teenager by two of my children, while the third recognized that I was perfectly capable of exercising good judgment about whom to trust. That night, I wrote in my travel journal, I'm discovering that the burden they feared I would become, an aging mother requiring caretaking and management, existed primarily in their imaginations, not in reality. The capacity for joy, for connection, for discernment doesn't diminish with age, it deepens. Perhaps this journey is teaching all of us that lesson. The following week passed in a glorious blur. Paolo proved to be an exceptional guide, showing me a Venice I would never have discovered on my own. Tiny workshops where artisans still practiced centuries-old crafts, neighborhood bars where locals gathered for morning coffee, hidden gardens tucked between ancient buildings. We took a boat to the colorful island of Burano, walked for hours through labyrinthine streets, and shared stories over leisurely dinners. I learned about his late wife, Sophia, who had died of cancer 5 years earlier, and his two daughters who lived in London with their families. He showed me photos of his grandchildren on his phone with the same proud enthusiasm I recognized from countless similar exchanges with other grandparents. The universality of it was comforting. Across cultures and continents, we shared the same fundamental human experiences. Will you stay in Venice forever? I asked one evening as we watched the sunset turn the Grand Canal into liquid gold. Forever is a long time, Paolo replied thoughtfully. Venice is in my blood, yes, but I have learned not to speak in absolutes anymore. Life has a way of surprising us when we leave a little space for possibility. Possibility. The word lingered. In my mind that night as I packed for the next leg of my journey, a train ride to the south of France, where I had rented a small apartment for a month in a village near Nice. Paolo had promised to come visit for a weekend if his schedule permitted. We had exchanged contact information and made tentative plans, both of us careful to keep expectations modest. Friendship knows no timeline, he said as he walked me to the train station. Whether we meet again next month or never again, what we have shared these past days is true and meaningful. His wisdom touched me deeply. So many relationships In my life had been defined by obligation, by shoulds and musts and responsibilities. How refreshing to form a connection based solely on mutual enjoyment, without expectation or demand. The south of France brought different pleasures: markets overflowing with fresh produce, fields of lavender stretching to the horizon, the Mediterranean sparkling in the distance from my hillside apartment. I fell into a peaceful routine. Mornings spent practicing my limited French with patient shopkeepers, afternoons exploring nearby villages or reading on my small terrace, evenings cooking simple meals with local ingredients or dining at the village bistro. I found myself thinking of Cedar Pines often, but with less pain and more perspective. The lake house had been a beautiful chapter in our family story, but its sale had funded this extraordinary new chapter. The memories remained. Thomas learning to swim, Rebecca's 16th birthday, Daniel's quiet afternoons sketching, but they existed within us, not within walls that had ultimately become a source of tension and unspoken resentment. Halfway through my stay in France, I received an unexpected email from Thomas. Unlike his previous terse messages, this one was several paragraphs long. He wrote that Jennifer had helped him see how his anger about Cedar Pines was rooted not in the property itself, but in his fear of change, particularly changes in me, his mother, the one constant in his life. "I've always thought of you as mom first and Eleanor distant second," he wrote. "Seeing your photos, reading about your experiences, I'm starting to understand there's an entire person there I never fully acknowledged. I'm sorry for that. I'm trying to do better." I read his words through tears, recognizing the tremendous effort it must have taken for my proud, stubborn son to admit these things. I replied with equal honesty, explaining that my journey wasn't a rejection of my role as his mother, but an expansion of my identity beyond that singular definition. "I will always be your mother," I wrote. "Nothing can change that. But I am also Eleanor, a woman with dreams and desires of her own. Both can be true simultaneously." As summer turned toward autumn, my European adventure began drawing to its natural conclusion. Paolo did visit for a weekend, bringing Venetian sweets and stories of his daughter's recent visits. We explored the coastline together, comfortable in our growing friendship, both of us grateful to have found a companion who understood the complex terrain of life after loss. When it came time to say goodbye, he kissed me lightly on both cheeks, in the European manner. "Remember, Cara Eleanor, you have a friend in Venice whenever you wish to return." The promise hung in the air between us, not a demand, not an expectation, but a door left thoughtfully ajar for whatever might come next. My final weeks abroad passed with a bittersweet awareness of ending. I savored every experience with heightened attention: the taste of my morning coffee, the sound of church bells echoing through narrow streets, the feel of ancient stones beneath my fingers, worn smooth by centuries of human touch. I began making plans for my return to Minneapolis, scheduling video calls with my children to discuss practical matters. To my surprise, Daniel suggested I might want to consider downsizing from my large family home now that I'd discovered a love for travel. "Not because you can't manage it," he clarified quickly, "but because it might free you to spend winters somewhere warmer if you wanted. Maybe rent a place in Italy or France for a few months each year." The suggestion, offered not as a solution to a problem but as an expansion of possibility, touched me deeply. Here was my son, thinking not about what would be most convenient for him, but about what might bring me joy. "I'll consider it," I promised. "But let me get home first before making any more major life changes." The morning of my departure from France arrived with theatrical perfection. Golden sunlight streaming through terracotta-tiled rooftops, the scent of baking bread wafting from the village boulangerie, church bells marking the hour with melodic precision. I packed the last of my belongings, carefully wrapping small gifts for each of my grandchildren: hand-painted ceramic figures from Italy, lavender sachets from Provence, colorful macarons from a famous Parisian bakery. The taxi arrived to take me to the airport, the driver helping with my luggage, now considerably heavier with souvenirs and memories. As we pulled away from the village, I looked back at my temporary home with a mixture of gratitude and loss. Something profound had happened to me here, a transformation as significant as any in my life. The woman who had boarded a plane in Minneapolis 3 months earlier, uncertain, apologetic, defined primarily by her relationship to others, was not the same woman returning home. I had reclaimed something essential that had been slowly eroding over decades of caretaking and compromise. Not selfishness, as Thomas had initially feared, but selfhood, the recognition that my life was still my own to shape, even at 63. The flight home gave me time to reflect on what awaited me in Minnesota. The practical realities of daily life would resume: bills to pay, a house to maintain, relationships to navigate. But I would bring back something precious from my travels: perspective. The knowledge that there were countless ways to live a meaningful life, that age need not diminish possibility, that courage often lies in beginning again. When the plane touched down at Minneapolis-St. Paul International, I felt a surprising sense of homecoming. For all my newfound love of exploration, this landscape of lakes and trees remained bone-deep familiar, a part of my identity I carried, wherever I went. As I emerged from the secure area, I saw them immediately: Daniel, Rebecca, Thomas, all standing together holding a hand-painted banner: "Welcome home, Eleanor the Explorer." Behind them stood their spouses and all 5 grandchildren, waving excitedly when they spotted me. Emma broke free first, racing toward me with the uninhibited enthusiasm of childhood. "Grandma, did you bring me something from Italy? Did you see the Leaning Tower? Did you eat snails in France?" I laughed, hugging her tightly. Yes, and absolutely not. The others surrounded me, hugs, kisses, overlapping questions about my journey. Even Thomas embraced me warmly, whispering, "Welcome home, Mom. We missed you." Daniel took charge of my luggage, Rebecca organized the grandchildren, and Thomas led the way to the parking garage where they had arranged a caravan of cars to escort me home. As we drove through the familiar streets of Minneapolis, I noticed how my perception had shifted. The city looked both exactly the same and entirely different, filtered now through eyes that had seen the canals of Venice and the lavender fields of Provence. "We thought you might be tired," Rebecca explained as we pulled into my driveway. "So we stocked your refrigerator and made sure everything was ready. But if you're up for it, we'd all love to have dinner together tomorrow to hear about your trip." "That sounds perfect," I agreed, touched by their thoughtfulness. As the family caravan departed with final waves and blown kisses, I stood alone on my front porch, key in hand. The house looked smaller somehow, though nothing had physically changed. Perhaps it was me who had expanded, growing beyond the confines of the life I had previously accepted as fixed and immutable. Inside, everything was just as I had left it: the familiar furniture, the family photos, the accumulated treasures of a lifetime. Yet something fundamental had shifted in my relationship to this space. It was no longer a cage of obligation, but simply a home, one of potentially many I might inhabit in this new chapter of my life. On the dining room table sat a vase of fresh flowers with a card signed by all 3 children. "To Eleanor, brave explorer, beloved mother, remarkable woman. Welcome home." The use of my name rather than simply Mom did not escape my notice. It was a small acknowledgement of the larger truth that had emerged over the summer. I was not just their mother, but a complete person with an identity separate from and larger than that singular role. That evening, as I unpacked my suitcase and sorted through souvenirs, I came across the travel journal I had kept throughout my journey. Flipping through its pages, I found the entry I had written the night after selling Cedar Pines, when doubt and guilt had momentarily overwhelmed my resolve. Have I made a terrible mistake? The lake house held so many memories, represented so much of our family's history. In selling it, have I betrayed not just my children, but Frank's legacy as well? 3 months later, I could answer that question with certainty. Cedar Pines had indeed been precious, not for its walls and dock and furniture, but for the experiences it had sheltered. Those experiences remained, treasured in memory, discussed in family stories, documented in photographs. The physical structure had served its purpose in our family narrative. Its sale had funded not just my summer of exploration, but something far more valuable: my reclamation of selfhood after decades of defining myself primarily through service to others. And in that reclamation, I had given my children and grandchildren a different kind of inheritance: the example of a woman who refused to disappear into the background of her own life story. I thought of Paulo's words about leaving space for possibility. My future stretched before me now, no longer a predictable progression toward dependency and diminishment, but an open landscape of potential. Perhaps I would indeed downsize, freeing resources for winter months in warmer climates. Perhaps I would take classes at the university, finally studying art history or literature. Perhaps I would return to Venice one day to explore its labyrinthine streets with my silver-haired guide. The specifics mattered less than the fundamental shift in perspective. The vacation home they thought they would inherit had given me something far more valuable than they, or I, could have anticipated: freedom. Not just financial freedom, though that was significant, but the deeper freedom that comes from recognizing one's own agency, one's right to self-determination at any age. As I prepared for bed that first night home, I paused before the mirror, studying my reflection. The woman who gazed back at me looked somehow younger than the one who had departed 3 months earlier. Not in the physical markers of age, which remained unchanged, but in the vitality of her expression, the clarity of her gaze. "Hello, Eleanor," I whispered to my reflection. "Welcome to the rest of your life." Cedar Pines was gone, sold to a Chicago couple who would create their own family memories within its walls. But the true inheritance, the capacity for joy, for growth, for reinvention, remained intact, stronger than ever. And that inheritance wasn't something to be passed down only after death. It was something to be demonstrated daily through how I chose to live. The next morning, I woke early, a habit retained from my travels. I made coffee and carried it onto my back porch, watching the sunrise paint the Minnesota sky in delicate pinks and golds. A text arrived from Rebecca. "The pie. Girls can't wait to see you tonight. Emma's already made a list of questions about Italy." I smiled, thinking of my curious granddaughter and the stories I would share with her, not just about ancient ruins and beautiful art, but about the courage it takes to begin again, to step into the unknown, to claim one's right to growth at any age. "Looking forward to it," I replied, then set my phone aside to simply be present in this moment of homecoming. The lake house was gone, but I remained, Eleanor Madsen, traveler, mother, grandmother, friend. Still evolving, still discovering, still gloriously, defiantly alive. The others surrounded me. Hugs, kisses, overlapping questions about my journey. Even Thomas embraced me warmly, whispering, "Welcome home, Mom. We missed you." Daniel took charge of my luggage, Rebecca organized the grandchildren, and Thomas led the way to the parking garage where they had arranged a caravan of cars to escort me home. As we drove through the familiar streets of Minneapolis, I noticed how my perception had shifted. The city looked both exactly the same and entirely different, filtered now through eyes that had seen the canals of Venice and the lavender fields of Provence. "We thought you might be tired," Rebecca explained as we pulled into my driveway, "so we stocked your refrigerator and made sure everything was ready. But if you're up for it, we'd all love to have dinner together tomorrow to hear about your trip." "That sounds perfect," I agreed, touched by their thoughtfulness. As the family caravan departed with final waves and blown kisses, I stood alone on my front porch, key in hand. The house looked smaller somehow, though nothing had physically changed. Perhaps it was me who had expanded, growing beyond the confines of the life I had previously accepted as fixed and immutable. Inside, everything was just as I had left it. The familiar furniture, the family photos, the accumulated treasures of a lifetime. Yet something fundamental had shifted in my relationship to this space. It was no longer a cage of obligation, but simply a home, one of potentially many I might inhabit in this new chapter of my life. On the dining room table sat a vase of fresh flowers with a card signed by all 3 children. To Eleanor, brave explorer, beloved mother, remarkable woman, welcome home. The use of my name rather than simply Mom did not escape my notice. It was a small acknowledgement of the larger truth that had emerged over the summer. I was not just their mother, but a complete person with an identity separate from and larger than that singular role. That evening, as I unpacked my suitcase and sorted through souvenirs, I came across the travel journal I had kept throughout my journey. Flipping through its pages, I found the entry I had written the night after selling Cedar Pines, when doubt and guilt had momentarily overwhelmed my resolve. Have I made a terrible mistake? The lake house held so many memories, represented so much of our family's history. In selling it, have I betrayed not just my children, but Frank's legacy as well? 3 months later, I could answer that question with certainty. Cedar Pines had indeed been precious, not for its walls and dock and furniture, but for the experiences it had sheltered. Those experiences remained, treasured in memory, discussed in family stories, documented in photographs. The physical structure had served its purpose in our family narrative. Its sale had funded not just my summer of exploration, but something far more valuable: my reclamation of selfhood after decades of defining myself primarily through service to others. And in that reclamation, I had given my children and grandchildren a different kind of inheritance, the example of a woman who refused to disappear into the background of her own life story. I thought of Paulo's words about leaving space for possibility. My future stretched before me now, no longer a predictable progression toward dependency and diminishment, but an open landscape of potential. Perhaps I would indeed downsize, freeing resources for winter months in warmer climates. Perhaps I would take classes at the university, finally studying art history or literature. Perhaps I would return to Venice one day to explore its labyrinthine streets with my silver-haired guide. The specifics mattered less than the fundamental shift in perspective. The vacation home they thought they would inherit had given me something far more valuable than they, or I, could have anticipated: freedom. Not just financial freedom, though that was significant, but the deeper freedom that comes from recognizing one's own agency, one's right to self-determination at any age. As I prepared for bed that first night home, I paused before the mirror, studying my reflection. The woman who gazed back at me looked somehow younger than the one who had departed 3 months earlier, not in the physical markers of age, which remained unchanged, but in the vitality of her expression, the clarity of her gaze. "Hello, Eleanor," I whispered to my reflection. "Welcome to the rest of your life." Cedar Pines was gone, sold to a Chicago couple who would create their own family memories within its walls. But the true inheritance, the capacity for joy, for growth, for reinvention, remained intact, stronger than ever. And that inheritance wasn't something to be passed down only after death. It was something to be demonstrated daily through how I chose to live. The next morning, I woke early, a habit retained from my travels. I made coffee and carried it onto my back porch, watching the sunrise paint the Minnesota sky in delicate pinks and golds. A text arrived from Rebecca. "The girls can't wait to see you tonight. Emma's already made a list of questions about Italy." I smiled, thinking of my curious granddaughter and the stories I would share with her. Not just about ancient ruins and beautiful art, but about The courage it takes to begin again, to step into the unknown, to claim one's right to growth at any age. Looking forward to it, I replied, then set my phone aside to simply be present in this moment of homecoming. The lake house was gone, but I remained. Eleanor Madsen, traveler, mother, grandmother, friend. Still evolving, still discovering, still gloriously, defiantly alive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.